The hot summer day was slowly fading over Atlanta. The orange rays of the setting sun lay on the fronts of neat houses and long rows of manicured lawns. In one such house, surrounded by a garden of fragrant flowers and slender trees, lived the Williams family. Jennifer Williams, happy and energetic, was preparing dinner in the spacious kitchen when her husband Isaac quietly entered the room. "Hello, love," he said, coming up behind her and gently putting his arm around her shoulders. Jennifer smiled as she turned to face him and lifted up slightly on her toes to touch her lips to his in a light kiss. Isaac looked tired after a long day at work, but his eyes still shone with the same warmth she'd seen in them since the beginning of their relationship. Isaac was the kind of man Jennifer was proud of. Tall, athletic, he was always impeccably dressed. His voice was deep, soft, and she loved listening to him talk about the business he was doing at the company. "How was your day?" she asked, returning to the cutting board where she was preparing vegetables for their dinner. "Tough as always," Isaac sighed, taking a seat at the kitchen island. "The investor negotiations dragged on, and I barely made it to a meeting with a new client, but it went well. I think we'll have a new contract in a couple weeks." "You still amaze me with your efficiency," Jennifer said, quickly slicing the tomatoes. "Someone has to have energy since you're all about the housework," Isaac grinned, picking up the wine glass she'd poured for him before they started cooking. Their life really did seem perfect. A few years ago, they had bought this house in an upscale Atlanta neighborhood. Jennifer was an interior designer and worked mostly from home, so they were both comfortable with it. She was proud that her job not only brought in income, but also allowed her to spend more time with Isaac. They did everything together, traveling, weekends, evenings alone. They supported each other in every endeavor and made sure their marriage remained as strong as it had been in the early years. Sometimes they reminisced together about the day they first met, at a conference in New York City, where Jennifer was a guest speaker and Isaac was one of the attendees. The spark between them flared up instantly. They've been inseparable ever since. "Do you have a business trip tomorrow?" she asked casually, turning the meat in the pan. "Yes, back to Charleston, but I won't be gone long. I hope I can do it in 2 days," Isaac replied, crossing his arms over his chest and listening to the quiet sizzle of oil on the stove. Charleston was a familiar city to Jennifer, even though she'd only been there once, and Isaac had been traveling there regularly on business for the past few months. She wasn't bothered by his frequent trips, because she knew that his work required such business trips. In addition, Isaac was always very open with her, telling her everything that happened at meetings and negotiations, sometimes even joking about the boring hours spent in the meeting rooms. However, the last few trips to Charleston had left Jennifer with a strange feeling. She couldn't say exactly what it was that made her uneasy, but Isaac seemed different after each trip. He returned more thoughtful, sometimes distracted, but his love and concern for her hadn't changed, so Jennifer decided not to worry too much. The evening went on, as it had all the previous ones. Jennifer and Isaac dined at the large wooden table in the backyard, enjoying the warm breeze and the smell of the fresh herbs she had recently planted. They were discussing plans for the weekend. Isaac had suggested going to the mountains to relax in nature and disconnect from the hustle and bustle of the city. "It would be a great opportunity to be alone," he said, sipping his wine and smiling at her. "I like that idea," Jennifer nodded. "It's been so long since we've been outdoors. You're always doing things. I'm all about projects." Isaac looked at her with a soft smile, then leaned over and took her hand. "You know you're the most important thing to me. A job is just a job. I will always choose you." Those words warmed her soul. He always knew how to calm her worries, how to show her that their relationship wasn't just a habit, but a real feeling. Jennifer smiled at him again, feeling light and grateful that fate had brought them together. When they finished dinner, Isaac helped put the dishes away, and kissing Jennifer on the forehead, told her that he needed to send a couple work emails before going to bed. She nodded, hugging him around the waist, and headed to the bathroom, determined to relax before a long evening. Everything was calm, habitual. They found comfort and coziness in their routine. Nothing heralded trouble. Late that night, already lying in bed, Jennifer heard Isaac return from his office. He lay down beside her, covering her with the blanket and putting his arm around her shoulders. sleep, sweetheart," he said softly. "Good night," she whispered, closing her eyes. But the night did not bring her peace. When Jennifer woke up a few hours later, she found that Isaac wasn't around. She went downstairs, assuming he might be working again. But the kitchen table was empty, and the light in the study was off. Suddenly, her gaze stopped on something strange. On the corner of the table lay an envelope that seemed to have just been taken out of the mailbox. It was a letter addressed to Isaac Williams, but the postmark read Charleston, South Carolina. The letter, stamped Charleston, lay on the kitchen table, barely visible in the semi-darkness. Jennifer froze, not immediately realizing what she was seeing. A sense of something wrong suddenly swept over her. Isaac had not said he was expecting a letter, much less one from Charleston, though he was often there on business. Her hand slowly reached for the envelope, her heart thumped harder. Carefully, as if afraid of discovering something irreparable, she opened it. Inside was an official document, a marriage license. Name of the groom, Isaac Williams. Bride's name, Lauren Harris. The date was 2 years ago. Her eyes widened. Her heart pounded like a hammer in her chest. Seconds seemed like an eternity as her mind tried to comprehend what her eyes saw. Isaac, married to another woman? Jennifer felt cold sweat break out on her forehead. Her world, her home, her family, all suddenly shaken, and the ground felt as if it had gone out from under her feet. Isaac, her one and only, with whom she shared a life, a home, and a future. How was that possible? Marriage in another state to another woman? She sat back in her chair, still holding onto the marriage application, her fingers trembling. Questions rose in her mind. Why? How long had it been going on? And worst of all, how could she not have noticed it before? Confused thoughts raced through her mind. Maybe this was a mistake? Maybe someone had forged the paperwork? After all, Isaac couldn't have done that. He couldn't have led a double life. Jennifer didn't believe her husband was capable of betrayal, but the document looked too real to just discard. There had to be proof. The next day began as if in a fog. Jennifer tried not to show that anything was wrong when Isaac left for work. Her thoughts were preoccupied with other things. She couldn't just sit back and wait for it all to fall apart around her. Answers were needed. She knew she would have to act quietly now so as not to arouse Isaac's suspicions, for every move he made seemed suspicious to her now. The first thing she did was find a law firm in Charleston. With the help of the internet and a little playing around with search terms, she was able to contact a small law firm that could help with a background check. She wasn't sure exactly who to contact, but her questions were clear and direct. Are there marriage records for Isaac Williams and Lauren Harris in the state of South Carolina? The attorney's response was quick and cold. Yes, that marriage is registered in our state. Is there anything else I can help you with? Jennifer could barely keep from crying right through the conversation. She thanked the lawyer and hung up, feeling her world shattering right before her eyes. This was reality. Isaac was married to another woman. But how long had it been going on? How could she not have noticed it before? Jennifer began frantically going over the last few months of their life together in her head. He'd been so attentive, so caring. But all those trips to Charleston, those business trips, were they really business? That night she continued her investigation. Her computer became a window into the life of Lauren Harris, the woman Isaac was married to. Through social media, Jennifer found several mentions of Lauren. A young, beautiful, and successful woman. By all accounts, she worked at a local Charleston banking institution. One of her photos showed a man who looked a lot like Isaac, though his face wasn't fully visible. Jennifer's heart clenched. This was a true confirmation of her worst fears. Her hands shook again as she scrolled down her profile, noticing that Lauren was actively posting pictures from recent events, trips. Had Isaac really been with her on all those trips he'd told Jennifer about? Everything she'd seen confirmed her hunch. Her husband was leading a double life. He was with Lauren when he claimed to be at client meetings or business events. The whole world around Jennifer, once so stable and solid, was now crumbling at breakneck speed. A deep sense of betrayal filled her mind. But it wasn't just betrayal. It was the destruction of their marriage, her trust, her love. How could she not have noticed it sooner? For a few more days, Jennifer had been watching Isaac, his behavior and habits. Now she was noticing little things that she had overlooked before. The way he lingered in the evenings, the way he rushed to send messages, sometimes averting his gaze from her eyes. It was all there. She just refused to see it. His business trips, his business meetings, they were lies. That much had become clear. She decided not to say anything to him. Not now. Jennifer wasn't ready for a direct confrontation. Her life had been turned upside down, and she needed a plan before facing reality. She spent her days at the computer trying to find more information about Lauren, and at the same time, researching ways to legally file for divorce if it proved inevitable. Her decisions grew along with her anger, but before she did anything irreparable, she needed to meet Lauren in person. This woman, her rival, she was the one who could shed light on this dirty secret. A few days later, Jennifer decided to take action. She knew Isaac was going to Charleston again, and this was her chance. Her heart pounded with fear and excitement. After excusing herself to her husband that she planned to spend time with a friend this weekend, Jennifer bought a train ticket to Charleston. She didn't know what she would find there, but she knew that inactivity would burn her from the inside out. The journey to South Carolina seemed endless. She stared out the train window, unable to focus on anything but what lay ahead of her. She had never felt so angry and hurt at the same time. It was like a storm was raging inside her. She was afraid of what she would discover, but she was even more afraid that she wouldn't be able to handle it. Charleston greeted her on a warm and sweltering evening. The city that had seemed so distant and foreign was now the center of her personal drama. Jennifer wasted no time. She found Lauren's address ahead of time and headed there using a cab. As she pulled up to the pretty house with its well-maintained facade and neat garden, she felt a shiver run through her body again. This was the very place where her husband lived. The place where he probably spent his time telling Lauren the same stories he told her. The place where his double life had evolved and flourished. Jennifer stood for a few minutes in front of the front door, her heart pounding frantically. She didn't know what to do next. When Isaac came home, his tired face betrayed nothing out of the ordinary. He closed the door behind him and walked leisurely into the living room, glancing at his watch. Jennifer was waiting for him, sitting in the semi-darkness on the couch, her body tense as a taut string. On the table in front of her were the documents she had found, and the anticipation of meeting her husband had heated the atmosphere to the max. "What are you doing up?" he asked, taking off his coat and not waiting for an answer, as if trying to avoid the conversation. Isaac sat down tiredly in the chair opposite, his eyes blank, as if his thoughts were somewhere far away. He noticed something strange in Jennifer's behavior, but he had not yet guessed what was weighing on her. It seemed that his fatigue was reflected in his whole being, but this calm was an illusion. She knew the truth, and that changed everything. Silence filled the room. Jennifer watched him silently, knowing that this moment would be a pivotal moment for them. She reached out, taking the papers from the table, and tossed them towards Isaac. "What's this?" Her voice sounded quiet, but every note in it trembled with restrained anger. Isaac looked at the papers, and his expression changed slightly, a barely perceptible shadow slipping into his eyes. He picked up one of the pages, read it, and immediately realized that it was useless to hide the truth any longer. He knew this moment would come sooner or later, but he didn't think it would be so soon. "You didn't think I was hiding it from you for fun, did you?" he said slowly, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Jennifer stared at him, her face like stone. She had held back her emotions for too long, but now her rage wanted to burst out. She stood up, turned away abruptly, and walked across the room. The shock of discovering the truth was too great, and now she couldn't control her feelings. "Why did you lie?" she said quietly, but her voice sounded like a blow. "How long has this been going on?" Isaac rose to his feet but didn't move. There was something cold in his gaze, something subtly sinister that Jennifer hadn't noticed in him before. "I wasn't going to lie to you," he said, his head down as if he were acting out his own drama. "It was a long time ago, Jennifer. Lauren. It was a moment of weakness." "Weakness?" She laughed a short, nervous laugh that sounded painful. "You married her, Isaac. That's not weakness, that's betrayal." The silence seemed to press against the walls. Jennifer boiled with anger, feeling the reality she knew crumbling right in front of her. Everything they'd built together was shattered by one document, one lie that had lasted for an unknown number of years. I swore I would never betray you, and you paid for my loyalty like this?" She continued, her voice much quieter now, but with each passing second the strength was building in it. "You ruined everything. You ruined us." Isaac didn't answer. He knew that no words could save the situation. His eyes burned with a mixture of despair and anger, but he remained silent. "I'll tell her tomorrow," Jennifer said suddenly, her voice as steady and cold as steel. "Let Lauren know who you really are. Let her suffer too." The words elicited a sharp reaction. Isaac raised his head sharply, fear disguised as anger flashing in his eyes. "Don't you dare!" His voice cut through the silence, and for the first time Jennifer saw in him not only a husband, but a real man capable of dangerous actions. "I can do whatever I want," she said calmly. "You gave me that right." Her cold words pierced his heart, and he realized that the situation was spinning out of control. For a few long seconds they stared at each other in silence, their gazes full of hatred and pain, mixed with remnants of past feelings. But now it was clear. There was no turning back. Finally, Jennifer turned away from him, her heart pounding frantically. She could feel her strength leaving her, her emotions no longer in control. The sound of Isaac's footsteps was barely audible as he left the room. He retreated to the bedroom, leaving her alone with her thoughts. That night stretched on endlessly. Jennifer couldn't sleep, her mind feverishly replaying the events of the past day. Everything that had seemed real to her was now in doubt. She pictured Isaac's face over and over again, his reaction when she'd thrown the accusations at him. What was that shadow in his eyes? Was it fear, anger, or something more sinister? In the morning, the house fell into an ominous silence. Jennifer got out of bed, feeling shattered, as if she'd been through a long nightmare. She headed for the kitchen, but the strange silence in the house alerted her. Normally, Isaac would have been up by now, getting ready for another day, but right now his presence wasn't felt. Her heart beat faster when she entered the kitchen and saw him lying on the floor. Isaac was motionless, his eyes glazed over, and there was nothing human in that look. There was a small pool of blood around his head, and a knife lying on the kitchen table a few feet away from him. The world froze. Jennifer stopped, her body seeming to refuse to move. Her ears rumbled, her heart pounding in her chest like a hammer. She couldn't believe this was real. In that moment, she felt nothing. No terror, no anger, no pain. Only emptiness. It was several minutes before she could tear her gaze away from the dead body. Her legs trembled, and she sank slowly into the chair as if she was afraid she would fall. Memories of the night before, of the fight, of her threats, flashed through her mind. It all seemed distant and unimportant now. Before her was another nightmare, a nightmare of reality from which there was no waking. Jennifer, struggling to come to her senses, slowly stood up and took a few steps toward Isaac. His body was cold, and she realized that he had died hours ago. It had happened during the night when she, tired and exhausted, had finally been able to sleep. Her mind was filled with thoughts, one scarier than the other. Who did it? Why? There were no answers, only the horrible feeling that it was all her fault. She ran out into the hallway and called the police, her voice shaking, but she still didn't fully realize what was happening. Her mind was foggy and her thoughts were chaotic. The words about what had happened sounded like someone else's, and she felt like it was still one of her nightmares she had experienced over the past months. But this nightmare was real. Isaac was dead, and now when the police arrived, this house would never be the same again. By the time the police arrived at Jennifer and Isaac's house, morning had already turned to noon. The officers cordoned off the house and began examining the crime scene, trying to pick up any signs of violent death. The air was silent, broken only by the squeak of boots and muffled conversations. Isaac's body lay in the same kitchen, still and cold, a testament to the tragedy. Jennifer sat in the living room, her face pale and her eyes red with tears and fatigue. Her mind was in chaos, her thoughts jumbled into a painful picture. The police officers had already asked her questions, trying to find out what had happened that night, but her statement was rambling, full of gaps and inner uncertainty. "You said you were asleep when it happened?" one of the detectives asked, his voice flat, almost impassive. "Yes, I was in the bedroom." Jennifer struggled to get her words out. "We had a fight and I went to bed. I didn't hear anything until the morning." "And when did you discover your husband's body?" "In the morning. He was already dead." Her voice shook, and the officer, showing no apparent empathy, simply continued to jot down her answers in his notebook. To him, this was one of many cases. In his eyes, she was already one of the suspects. The spouse who discovered her husband's body always drew attention as the main person of interest. Meanwhile, Detective Jameson arrived on the scene. He was an experienced investigator who had served on the police force for over 20 years. A tall, trim, middle-aged man, with wrinkles that spoke of years of working the criminal streets, Jameson had a knack for quickly getting to the bottom of complex cases. His intuition never failed him, but at the same time he never relied on his feelings alone. Evidence and facts were paramount to him. Jameson looked around the house, silently studying every detail. The kitchen looked like a typical murder scene. A dead body, a knife nearby, blood on the floor. But something about this picture seemed too simple to him. Usually, such murders looked more impulsive, more chaotic, but here it was too calm, too restrained. "Any suspicions?" he asked the officers standing in the kitchen. "At the moment, we suspect the wife," one of them replied briefly. "She claims she was asleep, but there are no signs of forced entry, and she was the only one in the house at the time of the murder." Jameson nodded, but continued his examination. He was not only interested in the crime scene, but also in what might have been hidden behind the obvious evidence. In cases like this, it was always important to consider what was not obvious at first glance. He decided to start with the easiest thing to do, which was to look into Isaac's life. The first step was an interview with Jennifer. When Jameson entered the living room where she was sitting, his gaze immediately caught her condition: lost, exhausted, as if absorbed in her own thoughts. But experience told him that there were many things behind it, from pure grief to an elaborate ruse. "Mrs. Williams, my name is Detective Jameson," he began, sitting down across from her. "I'll be handling this case. We already know some of the details, but I want to hear your version of events again. You say you didn't hear anything during the night?" "Yes," Jennifer answered, her voice weak. "We had a fight and I went to bed. I didn't hear anything until morning." "A fight about what?" The detective watched her reaction carefully. She hesitated for a second, but then made up her mind. "About the papers," she said quietly. "I found his marriage certificate to another woman in South Carolina. Turns out he had a second wife. I couldn't believe it." Jameson frowned. A second marriage? That explained the tension in the relationship, but it still required verification. He wasn't inclined to take anyone's word at face value right away. "Are you sure these documents are real? Did you check them?" "Yeah, I called a law firm in South Carolina. They confirmed that Isaac is married to another woman. Her name is Lauren. Lauren's name is now an important piece of the puzzle." Jameson wrote down her information and promised to find out everything he could about Isaac's second marriage. He thanked Jennifer for her help and soon left the house to investigate. At the police department, Detective Jameson began searching for information about Lauren and Isaac. Using access to databases, he soon found confirmation. Isaac was indeed married to a woman named Lauren Harris. This fact was recorded in South Carolina state records, which meant that Isaac's double life was more than just fiction. In an attempt to contact Lauren, Jameson traveled to South Carolina, where he managed to meet her a few days later. Lauren turned out to be a young, attractive woman who clearly had no idea that her husband had another life in another state. "I didn't know," she admitted, when Jameson showed her Isaac and Jennifer's marriage certificate. "He never talked about her. We were married 2 years ago, and he traveled a lot for business. I thought he was just working in another state." The detective noticed that Lauren was genuinely shocked to learn of the existence of another wife. This opened up new questions. Why was Isaac leading a double life, and did Lauren have something to do with his death? Lauren agreed to cooperate with the investigation, although her attitude was wary at first. She gave access to her communications with Isaac and talked about his last weeks, which didn't bode well for anything out of the ordinary. But Jameson sensed that there was much more hidden in this case than just infidelity and a double marriage. Meanwhile, Jennifer remained under police surveillance. Although she was the prime suspect, there was no direct evidence of her guilt. But her emotional state, coupled with the proven fact of her husband's adultery, made her very vulnerable in the eyes of the detectives. Jameson continued to gather evidence, including checking Isaac's bank accounts and phone records. He was soon able to discover that Isaac had traveled to New York several times in recent months, which seemed odd considering his second wife lived in South Carolina. The key was the discovery of several large transfers to an account registered in the name of a man with criminal ties. These transfers indicated that Isaac might have been involved in something much more serious than just a double life. Jameson had begun to suspect that Isaac's murder might have had as much to do with family secrets as with his activities outside the home. Now he had new questions. Was Isaac the victim of a criminal conspiracy? Detective Jameson scrutinized the case file. Several days of investigation had turned into a puzzle to be put together from the many scattered pieces. At first, everything had pointed to Jennifer, Isaac's first wife, as the prime suspect in the murder. However, one detail after another revealed an increasingly complex and confusing picture. Lauren, Isaac's second wife, turned out to be much more deeply involved in the case than first thought. During the investigation, the detective discovered that Lauren had long been aware of Jennifer's existence and realized that her husband was leading a double life. Not only was she gathering information, but she also hired a private investigator to keep an eye on Isaac. Jameson had screenshots of their correspondences, recordings of conversations, and photographs in his hands. Starting with minor suspicions, Lauren moved on to obsessive manic surveillance, watching Isaac's every move. She was even able to take a few pictures with him and Jennifer to make sure she was right. Every day became torture for Lauren. She endured the deception, suppressed her anger until she reached her breaking point. However, it soon became clear that Isaac wasn't the only one who had disturbed her peace of mind. Jameson became increasingly convinced that Lauren couldn't have committed the murder on her own, despite her strong motives. Her actions pointed to a woman who wanted to expose the truth, but not someone who could have decided to commit murder. Moreover, witnesses spoke of her emotional state on the day of the murder. She was confused and depressed, but not angry. However, it turned out that Lauren wasn't the only one who knew about Isaac's double life. The next few days brought new evidence that took the investigation to an unexpected turn. An important link in the case was Marcus, Lauren's brother. As Jameson dug into Isaac's past and his connection to Lauren, he stumbled upon Marcus's trail. The man wasn't just a part of his sister's life, he played a much more active role. Marcus had had a morbid affection for Lauren since childhood. He was always protective of her, eager to be there for her, especially after their father left the family. For Marcus, his sister was the only person close to him. When Lauren married Isaac, Marcus had a hard time hiding his dislike for his new son-in-law. He didn't think Isaac was good enough for Lauren and always suspected that he was playing foul. So when Lauren started telling him about her suspicions that Isaac might be cheating on her, Marcus's anger peaked. He began following Isaac in the same way Lauren had, but his motives were much darker. Unlike his sister who sought the truth, Marcus craved revenge. He believed that protecting Lauren's honor was his responsibility, and slowly began to hatch a plan to punish Isaac. On the night of the murder, Marcus arrived at Lauren's house, as he often did. They were talking in the kitchen. Lauren looked confused, exhausted, but was still trying to convince her brother not to get involved in her problems. She didn't realize that Marcus had already made up his mind. He felt that Isaac deserved to be punished for his betrayal. When Lauren left to go to the bathroom, Marcus picked up his phone and found messages from Jennifer. He saw them discussing the last few weeks and realized that Isaac had been with her that night. That was the final straw. Taking Lauren's car, he drove to Jennifer's house. He was filled with anger and couldn't hold back any longer. Meanwhile, Jennifer had gone to bed after her argument with Isaac. Their relationship had already been damaged by what she had learned about his marriage to Lauren, but after the last few conversations, she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She saw no point in continuing these arguments and left her husband alone in the kitchen that night, figuring she could talk to him more calmly in the morning. Marcus arrived at the house knowing that Jennifer wouldn't suspect anything. He managed to sneak inside. The house was quiet. Isaac was sitting in the kitchen, tired and exhausted after a long talk with Jennifer. When Marcus walked in, their eyes met, and Isaac realized what was waiting for him. Marcus didn't give him time to talk. The flash of rage that gripped him led to a short and tragic fight. Marcus grabbed a knife from the table and struck. The first blow was fatal, but he continued, immersed in his hatred. As Isaac collapsed to the floor, Marcus realized what he had done, but it was too late. He left the knife next to the body and hurried out of the house without waiting for Jennifer to return to the room. Jameson came to a conclusion about Marcus's role a few days later after examining all the evidence. The detective was able to confirm that the fingerprints on the knives belonged to Marcus, and neighborhood camera footage showed Lauren's car outside Jennifer's house on the night of the murder. However, the detective had to go deeper to understand the motives. Lauren wasn't directly involved, but her words, her fears and anxieties led her brother to this fatal act. When Jameson met with Lauren for a final conversation, she looked exhausted. She didn't know Marcus would commit murder, but her suspicions and surveillance had given him the information he needed. She felt guilty, but also relieved that Isaac wouldn't lie anymore. All she wanted was to know the truth, but she didn't expect the truth to turn tragic. Marcus, for his part, didn't deny his guilt when the detective came after him. He kept repeating the same phrase, "I did it for Lauren. He deserved to die." To Marcus, it was an act of justice, but Jameson knew that justice had nothing to do with it. It was cruel revenge, driven by blind affection and frustration. The whole tangle of lies, deceit, and betrayal eventually ruined the lives of everyone involved. When the case was closed, Jennifer was left alone, digesting the fact that her life had been built on lies. Lauren lost both her husband and brother, realizing that her attempts to sort out the relationship had led to an irreversible tragedy. Marcus received a life sentence but never felt remorse. He believed he had done the right thing, even though his actions had ruined the lives of everyone around him. Detective Jameson returned his thoughts to the case again and again. He closed it, but felt no satisfaction. Isaac's guilt was obvious, but that didn't make him deserving of death. It was one of those cases where everyone who was caught up in the cycle of lies and revenge bore the burden, and no amount of investigation could restore what had been lost.